Hello, and welcome to the Mapping the Doctrine of Discovery podcast. The producers of this podcast would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the Indigenous Peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And now, introducing your hosts, Philip Arnold and Sandra Bigtree.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I am Phil Arnold, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Religion at Syracuse University, as well as core faculty member in Native American Indigenous Studies, and the founding director of the SCANO Great Law Peace Center at Onondaga Lake.
And I'm Sandy Bigtree, citizen of the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne. And Phil and I are both founding members of the Indigenous Values Initiative, which fosters collaborative educational work between the academic community and the Haudenosaunee. We're located actually in Onondaga Nation territory, so they're a vital part of this collaboration. Everything is vetted through the central fire. We want to promote the message of peace that was brought to Onondaga Lake many thousands of years ago. Today, we will be speaking with Tupac Enrique Acosta.
Yes, our good friend, Nahuatl friend, Tupac Enrique Acosta is Izcaloteca, Mexica Azteca of TONATIERRA Institute, one of the original conveners of the gathering of Tlaltocan Aztlan in 1984, and lives and works in the O'odham territories of Arizona, Phoenix, that sent a message to Pope John Paul II calling for the Vatican State to re-examine the fallacious principles of the papal bulls of Alexander VI, purporting to grant domain over the territories and nations of Indigenous peoples. This letter received a response via the Vatican Secretary of State in May 1984 from the Office of the Bishop of Phoenix, which was incoherent, illogical, and paternalistic. Subsequent to 1984, TONATIERRA has been consistently advancing the dismantling of the doctrine of discovery in a series of coordinated community campaigns led by Indigenous peoples from the local, regional, continental, global contexts of geopolitical reference, operating as Secretariat of the Continental Commission of Abya, operating as Secretariat of the Continental Commission of Abya Yala. Welcome, Tupac, to our conversations.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, whatever it may be.
Can you tell us a little more about how you define the doctrine of Christian discovery?
It's a pathogen. It's a psychological pathogen that's been instituted over the past 500 years now as a deformation of our common humanity. And as a pathogen, you could compare it to, for example, the corona, right? The corona pandemic, The pathogen, the pandemic, It encompasses and is contagious to everything that it encounters, But as an intellectual pathogen, the agency of that, the spread of the pathology, because it produces the pathology of the normalization of what is the criminal activity of genocide and colonization. Like the virus has the shroud around it, the corona, right? The virus doesn't have a life of its own, correct? If it couldn't attach itself to another organic life form, there would be no place for this virus, in the natural world, either in the human being or any other organic life form, a bat, a monkey, any other creature, The virus doesn't have any instructions of its own. It has to ascribe to another living body to replicate itself. The same thing with this doctrine is that it has provided the pathological nature that normalizes what is the deformation of humanity and the institution of the crime against humanity, which is colonization and genocide, and specifically and in particular to the original nations of indigenous peoples of this continent, which, as you well know, why is it called America, right? I'm holding up here a document. You must be familiar with it. I'm sure your students would be familiar with it or might be interested in it. Have you guys ever read the Mueller report? You guys ever read the Mueller report?
No, I must admit I haven't.
I'm not talking about Robert Mueller. I'm talking about Martin Weissmuller, who produced the first cartography that denominated this continent as America in the year 1507. He was a German dude. He was an academic too. He was operating out of some institution in France, and they produced a document called Encyclopedia Cosmographiae in 1507. In this document, this is the first time that you saw the terminology of America applied to the landmass that is now known as the continent of America in this part of the world. According to who? Let's clarify. According to they who got here from the East, although they call themselves the West. They have a mythology, you know? There's a mythology that surrounds this narrative, and the voice, the core, the pater vocalis, the voice of the patriarchy that drives this narrative is coming from that patriarchal authority system that is built off of the papacy, papacy, papacy. You know, you can see the correlations to patriarchy and then the institutionalization of the state, no? From the divine right of kings, the Pope, and the divine right of states. Now we got the states, no? But here it is. In 1507, Martin Weissmuller presented the first map where he designated this continent, which was unknown to them, with the nomenclature of America in 1507. And based on this, it's been standardized and normalized, but even Martin Weissmuller came to recognize was a mistake. Because Martin Muller, what had happened was, he used the term America because he thought that Amerigo Vespucci had got here before Columbus. At that time, similar to the social media network realm that we live in now, such as the Zoom technology, the printing operations were becoming to be popularized. And there was a gentleman who wrote a narrative about his explorations as an investor and as a member of the expeditions to this continent. He wrote a narrative about that, and this guy's name was Amerigo Vespucci. And that narrative got popularized throughout the continent of Europe at the time. Martin Weissmuller made his map. The narrative that was popularized at the time was that Amerigo Vespucci had got here before Columbus, although he didn't get here until 1493, Vespucci. So what happened? Martin Weissmuller made two other maps, and in those two other maps, he took that name of America off of the continent because he realized he had made a mistake. If anything, he should have given it the name America, or Colombia, or Columbus, no? Because he recognized Columbus had beat Amerigo Vespucci. So even the guy who put the name of America on the map that everybody got on their dollar bills and in their currency and in their education, he recognized, hey, that's a mistake. But what had happened, it was too late. The pathology of building a society based on a falsehood, on a lie, no? It was already out there. It was already spreading. And based on that, 1492, 1493, what happened then? The papal bulls, right? What you had then was you had a context, a cultural context that was called a civilization. It's known as a civilization, no? But again, based on what concept of what it is to be a member of such a society, no? Whereas in distinction to what does it mean to be a human being who is a member of the original nations of the indigenous peoples of Mother Earth. Those are two concepts, no? The Doctrine of Discovery is the one that arrived in this continent based on that dominion concept of the patriarchy instituted with the papal bulls and then formalized in the systems of the states, no, through the Doctrine of Discovery in each national constitution from Canada all the way down to Brazil, right? Including Cuba. Everybody's talking about Cuba today, including Cuba. The foundation of Cuba's claim to sovereignty on that island, what is it? It's the original claim made by Spain in the time of the Viceroyalty. The same Mexico, the same Guatemala, the same El Salvador. It's the same story, different chapters of the same narrative, no? So in this experience that we've had in engaging, we never engage with this concept without predicating it. This is a process of dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, not necessarily for ourselves, within ourselves, because guess what? Neither Amerigo Vespucci Christopher Columbus, or Martin Muller, none of those guys have got the conceptual capacity to define our reality as original nations of Mother Earth. They just don't have the capacity and the intellectual framework that they're coming from. Why? Because they had already alienated themselves from a direct relationship with the natural world and Mother Earth. No? It's a system of domination. It's a system of alienation. No? And we would also add to it what we already said. It's a pathology. It's an intellectual pathology that has allowed for the normalization of colonization and genocide in this continent and around the world. But in order to do the diagnostic on it, no, you begin by analyzing and dismantling it, which we've done that part. The doctrine is dismantled. There's no place it can go in this world and proclaim itself according to the precepts, theological, philosophical, cultural, that it presented itself 500 years ago. It can't do that anymore with any rational validity, ethical legitimacy, or moral right, much less legal or political argument, no? Because it's an instrument of colonization, which is illegal. Colonization is illegal. The doctrine of discovery is the pathology that normalizes that colonization. It's a pathological system that has to be addressed as a pathology that has, similar to the corona, impacted and infected all of human society. But then you ask, well, where did, like they ask about the coronavirus, where did it start? How did it get started? Huh? And then you realize it might have gotten started here and there, but then how did it become so transmissible? What are the agents of transmission? White supremacy, for example. Huh? White supremacy as an instrument of European American colonization, to be specific. No? And then the institution of that supremacy concept in the legal system of the successor states to the doctrine in this continent across the board, without exception. No? But then again, you get to the final question, which is the first question. How did the colonizers come to normalize that pathology within themselves, to consider it normal to do that to another nation of the indigenous, the humanity of Mother Earth? How did that dehumanization process, the pathology produces the dehumanization, right? How it genocides the humanity. How did it get to that level without having first accomplished the dehumanization of the very colonizers themselves? In other words, you get to the point where you recognize that the first victims of this genocide and colonization are the colonizers themselves, because they have normalized this schema, psychological, political, cultural, religious, cosmological. No? They have normalized it to the point where it goes unquestioned. That's why it's called a doctrine. If you have a doctrine, you have a program running through your intellectual system. You're not even thinking anymore. You're just regurgitating or habitually enacting what the doctrine has already proposed to you. This is what it is to be a normal member of a society. This is what it is to be a normal society. And those are all agencies of pathology, and also eventually not only genocide and colonization. It has brought us now to the point of terroricide, the pathology of colonization, genocide, that is driven by the precepts of the doctrine of discovery as instituted under the regimes of Christendom. We're now at the point of terroricide, where the very capacity of Earth to be our mother, to be Mother Earth, is at risk and at threat. At least for us human beings. We know Mother Earth, we're not her only kids, right? We're not the only children of Mother Earth. She has many, and you know what? If we left the scene, I bet you a bunch of those other kids of hers, such as the flowers, the ocean life, they're not going to be too sad about our departure, in terms of the damage and the ecocide that's part of the terroricide. Ecocide is the dimension of terroricide. It's a dimension of terroricide that we have brought about. Talking about we now in the original sense of what it is to be an indigenous nation. Because we understand our indigenous nationhood is constituted of those reciprocal and complementary relationships that we have with the very powers of life and the laws of how those life powers interchange and correlate with each other in terms of the earth, the sea, the atmosphere, and Father Sky, Father Sun.
We're defined by the earth, and becoming detached from that special relationship that brings us good health and peace, reality becomes a construct. That's what we're living in right now. All over the world, people are unable to identify
Right,
what's real
right.
because they don't know. It's through this detachment to the natural world. So, this is work that will benefit all human beings on this planet if they can start deconstructing where we've come from this detachment to the earth. That's our only hope of grounding ourselves again and connecting to the regenerative energies
Well,
of creation.
Phil and Sandy, at one point, our our relatives, our elders up there in Onondaga, right? They were convened. There was a convening taking place among the Indians, and I mean the Indians from India, the indigenous peoples of that subcontinent of the India. They had a convening where they called the convening to discuss what is the alternative. You have the United Nations as a global system, and with the entry of China, no, now it finally achieved that global status. Until China actually joined the UN, it really wasn't a global entity. It was intended to be a global entity of world domination under the economic and political and military infrastructure coming out after World War II. But it wasn't until China joined that it really became a global entity. A meeting was convened in India by the indigenous peoples of India, to which our brother Owen Lyons was asked to attend. But because of the the issue of the passport entry and return, Owen couldn't make it, and I was asked to go in his stead. So I met with those folks in India, and then indigenous peoples there from all the world discussing what's the alternative to the United Nations system as a global system of self-governance that is built not from colonization and domination or doctrine, but from reality, the reality of our natural relationship with each other as a dimension, as an ecosystem, the human ecosystem, as an ecosystem of the planet, not as a dominator, not as a patriarchal, hierarchical, kingship system, but an element of a kinship system where we all relate to each other as being integrated and relate and in relation to each other through the cycles of life over the millennia, since time immortal. So I'm mentioning it now because at that point, what we recognized, we got a lot of instruction there. And although the doctrine of discovery is history, the paper bulls that are always mentioned, the dumb diversitas, and the history of how that become instituted as part of the cultural infrastructure of domination from the 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 concept of the divine right of kings and the divine right of states, etc. But when we got to India, they said, but there's something more to the story, which has to go back with the very first invasion of the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago by the Aryans, where they first instituted the pathology of white supremacy. 5,000 years ago. They took apart the culture of the Indus Valley, which wasn't a civilization. It wasn't built upon the concept of metropolis, the mercantile version of the mechanisms of greed, which basically that's what the monarchies of the world represent. They're mechanisms of greed. Instead of metropolis, the original culture of the Indus Valley was agropolis based. Agropolis, concentration, urban concentrations of populations, but not determined by economic systems of exploitation and expropriation. Agropolis, where the agricultural and nutritional foundations were interwoven into the settlements, even if they were at a scale. And those always included, by nature, a ceremonial and astronomical and cosmetric relationship with the star nations. So that alienation wouldn't exist at all either. What I'm simply saying is that this story, the 5,000-year story of the institutionalization of white supremacy that began with the Aryan invasion of the Indus Valley, and it was later extrapolated to become the mechanism that now produced the situation that you now have in the United States of America, right? Where Donald Trump is the president. He's the president of the white people of the United States of America. It doesn't matter what the vote is to them. They were never interested in the vote. The vote was just a mechanism to control by electoral system their position of domination on the continent. And recognizing that they were not going to be a demographic majority any longer, they moved into another phase of consolidating their positions of white power in isolation and in islands of power that are tied together with this ideology of white supremacy within the American version of the British Empire, extrapolated from the imperial superstructure of Christendom, which is built upon the doctrine of discovery.
Wow, that's powerful.
Wow.
That's powerful. So you're someone, as you mentioned, you're widely traveled. You go and advocate for indigenous peoples all over the world. You travel in Latin America often. So can you give us a sense of what the doctrine of discovery means, uh, globally? That there's a kind of unified sense that this is the origin of the problem, but then also give us a sense of how there are, different ideas about the doctrine of discovery, different language barriers, right? So give our listeners a sense of the importance of the doctrine of discovery globally, but also the particularities of how it's being played out in these different landscapes.
Okay. Well, let's start by first unpacking the concept of Latin America, right? Most people who use the term do not know that that term originated in Paris, France in 1853. The Spanish Empire, the English version of empire, the Portuguese version of empire, no? The Dutch version of empire, which the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee are familiar with, right? When the French saw this play being played out, they said, we want a piece of that pie, the American pie. So they said, we're going to carve out a piece of that pie, the French piece of that pie. We're going to call that piece of the pie Latin America. It came out of the Bonaparte power structure. In France, they said, we're going to go push our boy out there and we're going to create an empire in that continent. We're going to start with Mexico. We're going to push this guy called Maximilian. And we're going to create a beachhead in Mexico and from there move north and join forces with those white supremacists that are now in congregation in what was the Confederacy in the U.S. Southern states. The plan of Latin America was intended to join forces to create an alliance with the Confederacy in the South so that they can continue to perpetuate the white supremacy concept, but this would be the French version of it, no? To provide access to the French economic interests to the resources that are being expropriated and exploited on the continent. And so they sent Maximilian over to institute Latin America as a geopolitical construct. It didn't come from here. It's a ploy of empire. It's the French card in the deck. No? However, when Maximilian got here, what happened was the Mexicans kicked his ass at the Battle of Cinco de Mayo in Puebla, right? So therefore, in a lot of ways, especially for a Mexican, indigenous person such as I am, to claim the Latin America as a nomenclature, as an identity, is an oxymoron, or more, better said, it's like 40,000 morons trying to ride a single ox. It don't fit. It don't make sense. But we understand, to make the correlations, we don't understand it unless we have our own geopolitical construct and context to address these issues continentally, regionally, locally, and of course, globally, right? So do we have such a context? Yes, we do. One of the elements that has allowed us to regenerate and reconstruct this context, because whether it's against Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trudeau in Canada, Trump, Obama, who's the most recent guy? Who's the most recent guy in the U.S. Capitol? Biden, whoever it may be, or in Mexico right now it's Andres Manuel López Obrador. Before any one of these guys, any one of these countries, they do not define our nationhood, no? And for that reason, we came together in 2013 in a conference that was sponsored by ASU and assembled the first international Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery International Conference. And the Mapuches came from the south. We had people from the north. Steve Newcomb was there. Jake Edward was there. The people from Mexico were there. People from El Salvador, from Guatemala, the Mayas, the Aymara were there. We had a continental delegation that came together to address this issue of dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, because it was recognized and realized and it's articulated it's a common case with different chapters of stipulation. Canada, US, Mexico. The way it's been instituted and implemented is distinct and particular, but it's the same case. So to the issue that you're bringing up here, Bill, when we found this out, we knew this all along, but when we got together at the continental level in 2013 and put that argument together about how we were going to push back against that pathology in the 5 areas of law, education, religion, environment, and the youth, the future generations. That set of argumentation that we put together in 2013 has held up wherever we've taken it, because after 2013, we continued the process. We went to Mexico. We went to Colombia. We went to Chile. We went back to Colombia. We went to Mexico. We went back to Colombia. We went to Guatemala. We went to El Salvador. The same process has been unfolding with the particulars of each state mechanism has been institutionalized, the doctrine, to accomplish this dismantling of the Doctrine of Discovery under an organized framework that we call the Commission, Continental Commission, Abya Yala. That's our mandate, to take this information forward and present it in the local, regional, and national context of each country to move forward continentally to bring the case forward to the conscience of humanity, for the purpose of realizing in the world that we believe must come to be, is destined to come to be, a world of peaceful and just relationships that we need to have with each other if we're going to have a chance of addressing the climate crisis that is upon us all, upon us all, upon us all. In that climate crisis scenario, there is no they. It's all us. But to get a chance to have an effective response to the climate crisis, which is brought about by the climate crisis of the cultural climate that the pathology of the doctrine has normalized, well, what's the vaccine against that? The vaccine against that, the cultural vaccine to deal with that, is what we're speaking of here in this program. The process of dismantling, diagnosing, and moving forward and beyond that pathology to where it's not only dismantling, we have to supersede it. We're at that phase now. The doctrine has been dismantled. It doesn't hold up anywhere. Even the Vatican, the Pope, the bishop there in Syracuse, right? The bishop in Syracuse said, hey, that thing is no good. No? It's been dismantled. Even those who have been proselytizing it are saying what we've been saying all along. We're beyond that phase now. We're going into the next phase, which is now the superseding of the doctrine. I make this quote because why? At one time, even the Vatican taught that the sun went around the earth. The terracentric version of their cosmology. Then the version of the heliocentric with Copernicus, they changed their tunes. Well, maybe it's not like that. Maybe the earth is going around the sun. Maybe so. Okay. So which one is it? Is the sun going around the earth, or is the earth going around the sun, right? You ask that question, what would most people say today? They're not going to ascribe to the terracentric version, right? They most likely would say, well, it's really the earth is going around the sun, right? But in reality, the earth and the sun are going around each other because they're both centers of what is known in the Western world as mass and gravity, and attraction. And therefore there's rotation. And therefore there's this motion that correlates to the relationship of the mass and gravity that in which they're embedded, which we're embedded. And here's the distinction, I think, that is important to the point that Sandy was making. In our world, right? The point that Sandy was making, in our world, we don't have the distinction between science and spirituality, religion and culture. In our world, those are always intertwined. You know? We know that observation is the foundation of all science. And we also know that the science of observation is the science of science. And now we're talking about the quantum dimension of this systems of knowledge, right? And in that way, we know that in our language systems is taught the concept of what is known as gravity on one side, culturally or religiously, and the concept of what is known as gravity, physical attraction on the other side. We have one word for both of those things. It's the same thing. And that's what we say when we hear those words of thanksgiving that come before everything. It's the power that puts things in their place. Love, gravity. You take those two concepts and the Eurocentric, Indo-European language structures, right? Through which those doctrines are embedded, right? They're embedded through language structures, the grammar systems that are the laws of those laws by which they are articulated. Any legal system needs a language system to be implemented. What is the grammar of those language systems? And we see that alienation process began right back where that in the beginning, where they made that distinction between what is love and what is gravity. For them, for that psychology, that's two systems. For us, it's not. It's the power that holds the universe together and allows things to be who they are, what they are, and also, I'm going to close, when they are, which is known.
Do you need help catching up on today's topic? Or do you want to learn more about the resources mentioned? If so, please check our website at podcast.doctrineofdiscovery.org for more information. Now, back to the conversation.
I remember you came to Syracuse once, and we held a very short water ceremony, Onondaga Lake. And it was no big deal, We had Tadadaho there, Jake, others, and we were just out there next to the lake giving thanks. And they were using their language, right? That we were discussing it in the Onondaga language, which is their ceremonial language. And at the moment the ceremony had concluded, we saw birds, fish jump, birds fly. Everybody acknowledged the fact that we had done a good thing, and then we talked a little while, and so this is just kind of verification of what you were just saying, right? That if there is this sort of sense of gratitude along with words that are these ancient words, these ancient protocols that have the ability to connect us to the natural world, then the world responds, and that so much of that is lost. So much of that is just destroyed just think in terms of education, right? I'm an educator. The legacy of education of indigenous peoples is not good, right? So how do we we've got this conversation going on right now. We were just talking about the residential schools in Canada, residential schools in the United States. We've got twice as many residential schools in the US than they do in Canada. We're just talking about all the missions, California and throughout, Mexico, etc. So how are we to re-educate the youth? How are we to connect, give them hope, right? Because so much of what we're dealing with now is the legacy of the doctrine of discovery.
Yeah, I think I think before we started the call, the recording, we began to have this conversation because just yesterday I was on a call like this with some folks that put together the conversation on dismantling the doctrine of discovery in Mexico. And that was accomplished yesterday. The dismantling of the doctrine of discovery in Mexico is now done. It's done. Because, again, once the truth comes out, right, The truth is always more powerful than the lie. Why? Because the lie needs the truth to be a lie. The truth don't need the lie for nothing. It can stand on its own. And just like the ceremony at that lake, when the moment comes for that truth to be perceived, for it to be captured, for it to be lived, it's not just an intellectual experience. It's the intervention by Mother Earth on our behalf as her children. Hey, Mother Earth is telling us, guess what, kids? I have elders too, I've been around a long time, Mother Earth, she said that. Before I was even around as your mother, way back there, it was just a dream in the crater. And then time and time and time and time. Finally, I emerged, and I was just still an infant, an infinite infant. The potentiality of what I was going to be or could be, it was just barely there at the moment. The infinite infant. But then even there, as the cycles fulfill themselves, the young infinite infant becomes a child, and the child then becomes a young maiden. And she was a young maiden for a long time, long time. Finally, where she becomes mother, and now she becomes Mother Earth to us. We weren't even the first of the kids, right? Put it bluntly. We're barely getting here. Now we're going to mess it up for everybody else who's supposed to come afterwards? I don't know about that. That's not a good idea. Point is that Mother Earth, even though we're barely one horizon of her generation, power, the human horizon, from origination to where we are now. We, the indigenous peoples, the indigenous cultures of the planet, we're the oldest, longest living, we're the ecology of humanity in the planetary context in its original sense and context to the present. So we have the antidote to the pathology of domination, of dominion, of genocide, colonization, and terroricide. We have the vaccine to produce the antidote. But those of us who are the inheritors of these ancestral forms of knowledge, and by ancestral forms of knowledge, I'm talking again what Sandy mentioned, what she knows and what we know as well. That ancestral context doesn't go to the past only. It emerges through the past, but it's coming from the future generations. That's the ancestral context we're speaking of. And in that one, what we see, what we sense, what we feel is that Mother Earth, she got her first gray hairs already now. She's going to the ceremony. What ceremony? The ceremony, I'm going to be grandma, Mother Earth says. I'm going to be a grandma. I'm not the young Mother Earth I used to be. And I'm going to be grandma. My elders tell me there's a ceremony for her. We're going to pick you up over there. She's going. I got to go, she says. She's telling us, don't you want to come with me? What? You're going to try to stay behind? It's not going to work too good for you. There's nowhere for you to stay behind. The point is that those affirmations that you mentioned, Phil, we had one yesterday. The Doctrine of Discovery has been dismantled in Mexico as of yesterday. And from the 25th to the 13th of August, which is what's going to happen there, then there's a ceremony that goes back 5,114 years that coincides with the Citlaquiahui, the rain of stars, which is known in the Western astronomy as the Perseid meteor shower. That represents our origin, a point in our creation stories, in our origin as being people of the corn, of the nations of the corn. That ceremony is going to take place on August the 13th of this year, which is so significant to what I just said, because on August the 13th, 1521, precisely 500 years ago, that's when the fall of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and the Spanish came in to institute this doctrine of Christendom, of domination, colonization, genocide, that has been normalized for 500 years until yesterday. Yesterday, that smoldering flame of resistance erupted and emerged to the bright flame of regeneration, the regeneration of our original nationhood tied to that star knowledge of being the children of Mother Earth, and also to our superseding of the Doctrine of Discovery in the social systems that have been instituted in Mexico in particular over the last 500 years, from the 25th of this month, July, to the 13th of August, which is 20 days. Our calendar is built on bundles of 20 days. There's 20 days of ceremonial activity going to be taking place throughout Anahuac, which is our geographical term for the territory that we know to be Mexico today. That's going to be taking place. So the other people that were joining in with us in that event yesterday out of Mexico were the Mapuches in the south as well, right? Alcan was part of that, because this is truly not only a local, a regional, a continental, but a global effort. It's also a cosmetic synchronization. And that sounds like a big word, but to us, it's just the nature of what we are. We're children of Mother Earth, and that's our Father Sun. And we know that Father Sun is a star. We know that Father Sun as a star has got other fathers and grandfathers further on out there. It's just that this particular star is the one that's not so far away, and that's our Father.
Friday, the 13th
Friday the 13th
of August, 2021.
1521, from 1521 to 2021, 500 years.
500
Yeah.
years.
Mhm.
That's an
Right.
auspicious
It's
day.
5,113 years, actually. Our count is 5,113 years, actually.
Hmm.
That's the foundation of our calendars. Goes back to that.
Tupac, could we ask you to talk a little more about what is the nomenclature of the doctrine of discovery for people in Mexico, for others, Spanish-speaking people, right? Indigenous peoples. I know, many of our listeners have to appreciate that, Catholicism has been sort of inculcated into indigenous societies for a very long time. Um, so, can you help clear that up for our listeners, right? The role of religion and how they understand the doctrine of discovery functioning on, and what kind of words that they use to describe it.
That's a good question. And it came up again in the call we had yesterday out of Mexico, which was again a call at the national level. The terminology that's most likely used as a reference to refer to the impact of the doctrine of discovery and its institutionalization throughout all of the countries of the South, beginning with that concept of Latin America, no? The terminology that's usually used, most commonly understood, is called Las Bulas Alejandrinas, the papal bulls, the Pope Alexander, no? That's the term that's most commonly used. It's understood the concept of the doctrine of discovery of Christendom, that's embedded in that because they're referring to the very head of the patriarchy itself, no? The papacy itself, right? Which was the divine right of kings instituted, right? Through the Roman Empire and its successor as the Holy Roman Empire, which then degraded into what is the papacy, right? No? Christendom in any case, right? And in all cases, right? Emphasis on the dumb. Excuse me for that. Anyway, that was a joke. Anyway, the point is that in that call yesterday, Phil, the preliminary study that was accomplished by our sister Tanya Ganella Fishner, right, in 2010 and submitted to the UN came up and it was acknowledged. Well, you know what? This study primarily focused on the Johnson versus McIntosh decision and the implications of that decision in the Anglo-American law systems in North America, Australia, and New Zealand. That preliminary study was only intended to be the preliminary study to a full study. So yesterday, that full study moved forward once again. The Continental Commission that we've been conversing about and communicating through over the past 8 years, since that conference in 2013, last night made a moment of determination to move that commission forward to accomplish the full study, case by case, country by country, all the way to Brazil, no? With no exceptions, including Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, no? Trinidad, Tobago, all of these states in this continent. You ask the question, well, what's your claim to jurisdiction here? If you have a state, what, you just show up out of nowhere or what? And without exception, it's always the doctrine of discovery. To answer that question in its particulars, country by country, the case law is different. But in terms of Mexico, for example, it wasn't the Johnson versus McIntosh Supreme Court decision that played out. The institutionalization of the doctrine of discovery in Mexico came out as a result of when they broke off from Spain beginning in 1821 and created the first empire. The first breakaway from Spain was just to create another version of empire under the Emperor Iturbide, again tied to that French monarchy, right? It was a power play. They kicked, just like the gringos did, no? They kicked the king out, but kept the crown. In other words, the claim to territorial domination and jurisdiction, the doctrine, they kept it, no? And that process continued all the way up through the different formations of the country of Mexico as a republic in the Constitution of 1917. In 1917, the Mexican Constitution, which is the Constitution that is still in place today, put the term original property of the state as the determinant to define the jurisdiction of the republic that was going to be officialized with this constitutional framework, no? Original property of the state. What is that? When you look it up, open up the books and read what is said there, that concept of original property of the state is referring precisely, specifically to the papal bulls of Pope Alexander, las bullas alejandrinas. You see what I'm saying? That's how it's been done. And if you go country by country, we've done that in Peru, in Colombia, in Brazil. When you open up their law books and say, what's the basis of your jurisdiction or claim, purported claim to jurisdiction of state, they always come back to that same answer. Las bullas alejandrinas, the papal bulls, the institutionalization of those papal bulls in the legal infrastructure of the states. And that also goes for Cuba. It goes for every single state that is known as an American state, because they are all successor states through the doctrine in terms of their claims to territorial jurisdiction. So then that's the issue that's at hand. So if you have a case such as that, which we do, how do you present your case to the international world community? The dilemma that we have is that it requires such a simple question. The question is so simple that it's hard to get to the simple answer. It's a common case in Canada, Mexico, US, Brazil. It's a common case that we have. It's systematic. It's systemic. Therefore, to respond systematically and systemically, we have to respond also systematically and with our own systems. In other words, our own cosmographical, sociological, spiritual, cultural systems. Do we have such a system? I can tell you we do. I've had that experience. We know that. We proved that to ourselves at the first continental encounter in 1990 in Quito, Ecuador. And since then, the continental process of the indigenous movement has proven that time and time again, including the fact that we had that conference here in Phoenix in 2013, no? Including the fact of what just happened yesterday in Mexico. These were initiatives of the Continental Commission. The point I'm getting to, Phil, to Sandy and Adam, is that how do we, if we're being attacked systematically, how do we be the we that we need to be to address this issue in a geopolitical context that's indigenous in its own generation and formation and expression? How do we be the we that Creator meant us to be? I think we have the answer, but sometimes it seems the answer is just too simple. It's not that it's so complicated, it's just that it's so simple and we complicate it.
Well, it was mentioned in another interview that we had that as the colonizer is doing its dastardly work, the indigenous people are paying attention and they're watching, and that's the cultural construct of indigenous people. They pay attention to the natural world, the environment, other human beings. So it's you're ready and you're observing this. Now is the time for indigenous peoples to have their voice, because they have been thinking about this since first contact. I mean, the church came in and was used to install the patriarchy, which is a hierarchical system. We've worked with church leaders before, and they work with the Haudenosaunee, and they randomly interchange the word creator for their God. And at every opportunity, I would always say, no, you can't do that, because your God is hierarchical and our creator is not. It's relational. We don't base our
Right.
culture on hierarchy. And
right.
it took some doing and constant reminding, these people, no, they're not the same, until I asked, admit to me, is not your God a hierarchical God? And I got the response, yes, he is.
Well, Phil, I think you probably know this as well, but one of the most interesting presentations in this issue were the comparative studies of Joseph Campbell, no? And he breaks it down very, very well, I thought, when he talks about the creation stories of Marduk, no? Of how this concept of monotheism, no, took root in that part of the world, the Middle East, what they call it. Middle of what? I would have asked. But, we had the same experience here when we had another session in this conversation on dismantling the doctrine. We brought in a Jungian psychologist, no? And she broke it down for us. She says, well, it's a form of trauma that the European colonizers carry that allows them to normalize what they know not to be not right. They know in their gut, this ain't right. Something wrong here, no? But it kind of inoculates them, no? To the pathology where they can live in that pathological world and pretend to think that it's normal when they know it's not normal. We're not meant to be as human beings like this. We're meant to be human. We have the right to be human, no? And that is the law. It's as simple as that.
This reference to the bulls that you
Right,
that you get in all these different state contexts,
right,
is more precise in a way than the doctrine of discovery, right? Because in Johnson v. McIntosh or Cheryl Oneida v. Cheryl or all these other kind of, legal formulations of the doctrine of discovery, it's about
right, right,
masking what's really going on here, right? It's about
right,
masking the Catholic or Christendom's route to land taking, right? And that becomes a kind of Protestant strategy. I would like to say, it's a kind of Protestant strategy of masking what comes out of the Vatican in the 15th century, right?
right.
So it seems like your folks are telling it more like it is, like what they're getting right at the root of the thing.
That's the whole point, I think, because, like, for example, as you know, Phil, and I think Sandy, you know this as well. At one point, we sat down with the papal nuncio, right? This is the ambassador of the Vatican State. I mean, the Vatican, Catholicism, Christendom is a religion, right? One of the originator of that is the Holy Roman Catholic Church as a religious body, as a religious institution, etc., 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 right? But yet, for us, we know that that's not really three different religions: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. That's one religion with three branches, right? They're all sons of Abraham. They all belong to that monotheistic scripture of being subscribers, no? Really, literally subscribers of that written. Again, you're talking about the grammar system of the colonizing, of the domination system. It begins with an intellectual grammar, right? Where you try to get that fragmentation away from the natural feedback loops of the natural world. No? And then you start to live into that fragmented psychology, and all kinds of stuff goes wrong, right? Including the situation we got now. But point being is that at that juncture of identifying the papal bulls, and the instrumentation, the method of how those are used as instrumentations, right, of the colonization, the genocide. What has happened is that the, the indigenous peoples in the South, as you know, they're paying an extreme price in blood and bodies. We have situations right now just across the border over the past 2 months. We've had 20 assassinations in the fight over the Rio Yaqui just over the past couple of months. One of our main leaders, who you might remember him, Mario Luna, he's right now in hiding with his family because of what's going on there. And one time I was having a conversation with our relatives, the people in the north, including those of Canada, and asked the question, how many of our people have we had that have been killed in the front lines of our fight of Indigenous peoples in the struggle of the last 2-3 years? The numbers were being added up. It was about maybe not even this many. You ask the same question about how many we've lost in Mexico, and we're talking about 2 or 3 dozen people just assassinated, killed. right in their full steps. People were at the forefront of the fight of the mega development projects, that are being used to accomplish the invasion that was initiated with the Doctrine of Discovery and the institutionalization of the state mechanisms, through the papal bulls, the territorial claim, in other words. So here's the fundamental question. Okay, suppose that the papal nuncio told us that all those papal bulls have been abrogated. They no longer mean anything to us in terms of the dogma of church canon law. They don't mean anything, but we've already taken care of that. It's not our fault, they say, that those dogmas, those doctrines have been instituted in the state mechanisms through the papal bulls, the Alexandrian papal bulls, to create the claim for territorial domain, jurisdiction, over the indigenous people. That's not our fault, because we already abrogated them as far as we go, they don't apply. Okay, then. But as that same person, okay, then, so no wonder there's that corporation that just killed a brother down there in Oaxaca or in Colombia, or even Canada, or any place where one of these mega development projects has been forced in with a concession given to that corporation by the state, a mining concession, a licensing concession. Where would the legitimacy of that concession be if the theological argument of the doctrine wasn't still in place? Those concessions would be completely invalid, and they are completely invalid. The bottom line is this: they tell us that they abrogated it. The article that came out about the bishop there in Syracuse, who says that according to us, we don't go by those teachings any longer. But if you ask that question to the people in the South, they never heard that from their church authorities. They never got that information. They never got the memo that the doctrine has been abrogated. They never got that memo. They never were given a sermon on that. That hasn't happened. But yet, nevertheless, regardless, no matter what, 5,113 years of history continues to reveal itself in that version of history, in our narration of history. The doctrine of discovery never was valid. And all it produced was a legaloid system. It's not a legal system. It's not a legal system. I don't care how much Johnson, McIntosh, Marshall, or the Constitution of Mexico try to imply or enforce it as a legal system, or the corporations try to use it as a justification to continue the extrapolation and extraction of the land resources. It is not a legal system. It's a legaloid system. It's a legaloid system. If it was legal, there would be justice, there would be harmony. That's not the situation that we have. We have colonization and genocide continuing on the levels of the society through the institutionalization of the doctrine of discovery through the papal bulls in the constitutional frameworks across the board, including Canada and Brazil.
I'm so glad you said that, because from a point of view of religion, history of religions, this becomes an elaborate system of belief, an anthrocentric version that the world is there for us as human beings. We're not here for the world, right? And that kind of simple belief system, in a way, is what holds up these systems of domination and genocide. It almost becomes normalized in our modern world.
I mean, people actually believe they own their property, but it can be taken away at any instant through
The state.
the state. Yeah.
We don't own anything. But then from an indigenous perspective, that's absurd. That's an absurd notion just on the face of it.
But it's all about your faith and your belief.
Yeah.
And that's what these religious institutions have drilled into all of their parishioners, that their true God exists elsewhere, and it's just this belief. And then they're able to, go about their business in extracting all the resources.
But it's a pathology. It's a pathology.
Yeah.
No.
It is.
It's
better
a
way of saying
destructive pathology.
Mhm.
It's the road to doom. It's the path of extinction. And sadly, our diagnostic of the situation is that the pathology of white supremacy, through which the doctrine, the papal bulls are being implemented, instituted, without that, it wouldn't have the power that it has. If the constituencies of white supremacy weren't there to grab that belief system and put it to their use, Come on. You can tell me your God really believes that white people are superior to everybody else? That's what you're trying to tell me? Come on.
Yeah.
But they're not saying that out loud, but that's how they're exercising it. The
Yeah.
tragic part of it is that in our analysis, in our diagnostic, these constituencies of so-called white people have determined to go to their extinction, to their doom, and they're going to die as white people. The white people concept itself is another version of this pathology, right? It's another dimension of the pathology. That's why I mentioned that part about the 5,000-year-old story of how that white supremacy concept has become the field of context, no? For how the doctrine took root, no? It took root and it grew deeper in that larger pathological construct of supremacy, human supremacy over another human by using the concept of whiteness.
That's tremendous. We've come full circle here in this conversation. I think it's a good place to wrap it up. So we're looking forward to future discussions.
And please check our website, and we'll have a lot of the notes listed for today's show with Tupac and other resources that you can access online. So thank you very much for joining us. We enjoyed our discussion with you, Tupac, and be well as you go about your day. And we'll talk with you again soon.
That's our show. Thank you for tuning in, and to our guest, Tupac Enrique Acosta, and our hosts, Philip Arnold and Sandra Bigtree. The producers of this podcast were Adam DJ Brett and Jordan Brady Lowe. Our intro and outro is Social Dancing Music by Oris Edwards and Regis Cook. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Syracuse University Engaged Humanities and the Department of Religion, along with Indigenous Values Initiative and the American Indian Law Alliance.